This course is about understanding higher cognition in terms of brain anatomy, physiology, and chemistry. And it is certainly true that we are able to understand some very complex electronic systems, and the question is whether the techniques we use to understand these systems can be extended to understanding the brain. But a first important step is to ask what exactly we mean by understanding. Now, in MRI images of a living brain, or physical slices made of a post-mortem brain, we can see major anatomical structures like the cortex, the thalamus, the cerebellum, and so on. Each of these structures has got more detailed substructures like the columns in the cortex or nuclei in the thalamus. All of these major and more detailed anatomical structures are made up of neurons, and the human brain has around 86 billion neurons. Each neuron has a complex structure. For example, a dendritic tree with lots and lots of branches. And at an even more detailed level, there are, for example, synapses. On average, a neuron has inputs from about 10,000 other neurons. And each of these inputs arrives at a different synapse, with most of the synapses located on the dendritic tree. And a synapse, like all the other parts of a neuron, has vast numbers of molecules that play different functional roles. For example, the molecules embedded in the external wall of the synapse that detect neurotransmitter molecules released by the neuron that's providing the input, like the 4 GABA neurotransmitter receptors that are illustrated at the bottom. Now, at any point in time, quite a lot of neurons are producing outputs. So an extremely high proportion of the neurons must be processing inputs from other neurons to determine if they also should produce outputs. This processing is the operation of vast numbers of coordinated chemical reactions. And all this activity over a period of time somehow results in cognitive behaviors. Now, clearly we don't have the ability to simultaneously imagine all the activity of all the billions of neurons that are doing something during a behavior. Even less do we have the ability to imagine the activity of all the molecules. So, what would it take to feel that we understand cognition in terms of brain activity? Now, to emphasize the difficulty of the problem, bear in mind that neurons differ in their appearance. They also differ in their internal chemistry, and even neurons that look similar have inputs from different groups of other neurons. So every neuron is performing a unique set of processes. So, can we achieve understanding by sort of throwing computer power at the problem? We could try to create detailed electronic models for each of the 86 billion neurons, models for their 100 million connections, and then run the model to see what it does. The problem is that even if we could do that, and even if our model then showed some intelligent behavior, all we've ended up with is another very complex system that we don't understand. Now, in the case of one very simple species of roundworm, the connectivity of every neuron and every connection has actually been mapped. There are only a few hundred neurons in this brain, pretty much the same ones in every worm. Lots of the connection strengths between these neurons have also been determined. We can destroy individual neurons and determine the effect on the worm's behavior. The neurons responsible for the worm's tendency for wiggling backward when it's poked on the head or squirming forward when it's touched on the tail have actually been identified that way. But these neurons are connected to other neurons. What else are they doing? Now, this connectivity has been known for several decades, but even with this detailed circuit diagram, there's no intuitively satisfying understanding for how complex behaviors result from neuron activity, even for a simple organism like a worm. So, what would it mean to understand a complex phenomenon or a system in an intuitively satisfying way? Well, let's start with a very familiar example. Do you understand how television works? Well, again, that depends on what we mean by understand. A small child understands how television works in the sense that he can use a remote to turn the television on or off, or to change the channel, or to adjust the volume. But sometimes his actions on the remote may produce results he doesn't expect, and he doesn't know what to do. So his understanding is only approximate. For example, if the television isn't connected to cable or an antenna, the actions on the remote won't produce the expected results. Now at that point, a deeper understanding is needed, that television receives signals from distant locations and uses electrical power to decode and display the signals. That kind of understanding could result in actions like connecting the television to cable. But that kind of action wouldn't be indicated with just the higher level of understanding. However, even this deeper level of understanding is still only approximate. If power and signal are connected correctly, but the television still doesn't work, an even deeper understanding is needed. Repairing a television to solve that kind of problem requires understanding that the signals carried on cable or antenna include many different stations and require amplification, then extraction of one station from many others by demultiplexing, followed by separation of voice and visual signals, and finally driving the screen and the loudspeakers. This even deeper understanding includes that different functions are performed by different components on a printed circuit assembly, including different integrated circuits. But if it was necessary to design a component making up a television, such as an integrated circuit, an even deeper level would be needed. For example, knowing how to arrange various functions on a silicon chip so that everything worked together to achieve the desired results. A yet deeper understanding would be needed to design the standard cell logic and the other functions that make up an integrated circuit, like the 4 input NAND gates illustrated. An understanding may need to include quantum mechanics if you want to design the transistors. So we can draw some lessons from our television example. A full understanding of television is actually a hierarchy of descriptions with some very specific properties. On any one level, when we say we understand something, we mean that we know what results will follow from certain actions. In other words, our understanding is causal. At high level, if you press a specific button on a remote, the television turns on. At an intermediate level, if you provide a given set of inputs to an integrated circuit, a specific set of outputs are generated. At a detailed level, if you apply a voltage to one terminal of a transistor, a current passes between two other terminals. If we change the geometry of a transistor, its behavior changes in a predictable manner. But the causal predictions at higher levels are only true for limited ranges of situations. They work well in those situations, but fail outside the range. Descriptions become more and more precise as you move to the more detailed levels. Sometimes the television doesn't turn on in response to the remote, and we have to shift to a more detailed level to find an appropriate action. So only small segments of the full end-to-end description of a process at high level can be described at a detailed level if you need to stay within human mental bandwidth. Of course, you can think about different detailed segments in turn and then understand how they fit together by shifting to a higher level of description. This shifting means that there has to be some clear mapping between levels to make translations straightforward. We have to know how to shift between levels. We must be able to map the description on a higher level of description to a more detailed level and vice versa, and part of understanding is knowing when such a shift is needed. In other words, when is the higher level description too approximate for what we're trying to do? If necessary, we have to shift through level after level, selecting a smaller segment at each level for mapping in more detail, until we find a segment at a level where we can resolve our problem. Our minds can only handle a small segment of a complete high-level description at one time. But at the same time, we have to know how to fit together lots of detailed segments. The existence of this hierarchy means that descriptions on any one level are intuitively satisfying, because we know how to fit those descriptions into both higher and more detailed levels. So, understanding television means that humans have created a hierarchy of descriptions with some very specific properties, customized to human intellectual capabilities.